So it just so happened that what I was reading in the Bhagavatam, it just so happened in the song sung by Lord Shiva that it says that Prabhupada was defining thinking, feeling, willing as generally applying to psychic movements. So it could include the intelligence and the false ego. Just in what I happen to be reading in my systematic reading. So there you go. That may be your answer. Because often Prabhupada said it's the mind, but here he was identifying it as a subtle body in general. So, isn't that cool how that kind of thing happens? You want to know something, and there it is. Okay, so we're going on. My plan was... we'll see. My original plan is that I would finish this whole PowerPoint this morning. That might not happen. I might do the last third after lunch. We'll see. Okay, so we're going to go on to our emotional side, our elephant. How to motivate for desire. So the first thing we want to do is find the feeling. What emotion is associated with this change? Or what emotion can we bring out? Because remember, it's the emotional part of the mind, the emotional part of the psychic body, as Prabhupada was saying here in the fourth canto, that is what's going to drive change. The elephant has the power to bring a change forward. And if you haven't engaged the feelings, people's feelings, they're not going to act. So here's a very nice story. It was a company that was wasting a lot of money in their purchasing department. So the one person in the company, I think it was an intern, not even a paid employee, low down in the totem pole, no actual power in the organization, was looking for a way to speak to people's emotions. So in going around the company, all the different aspects of the company, he noticed that in many different parts, they used different work gloves. They used altogether about 450 different kinds of work gloves, even to do similar work. Each of these 450 kinds of gloves was purchased from different places for different prices. Now, in some cases, the gloves were the same in different parts of the company, but they were bought from different places at different prices. So they might be bought for $5 from one place and $13 from another place, even though they were the identical gloves. Now, if we were going to appeal just to the writer, to the intellect, we might make a nice graph and chart. Here are all the different gloves that are used in different parts of the company. Here's where they're purchased from, and here's what they cost. Is that an emotional appeal? I had a really interesting experience recently teaching at the GBC College. I talked to the participants about the value of doing good research, right? You were asking, do we need to research? That was you, right? The value of getting good research. And then I shared with them on the topic I was teaching some of the very few existing studies on this topic in ISKCON. Immediately, 4 of the people in the room started falling asleep, even though it was before lunch. And I was amazed. I had just talked about the value of research and information. I was presenting some gems of information, and immediately, as soon as there's tables and graphs and charts and numbers. Good night. It was astonishing. It was like I'd hit them over the head with a sledgehammer or something. I was just kind of like, wow. So what this intern did was he went to all the parts of the company. Am I too soft for you? Is it too quiet? You're struggling to hear?
For me?
Ah.
Better if a little bit louder, but anyways.
I'm not sure if I can get louder without hurting my voice. Maybe you can make the volume a little louder? Just little. Or maybe you could sit a little closer. That might be a better solution. There's some room there. You could take your chair and bring it there. Hello, Hare Krishna. Hare Krishna. Krishna, Krishna, Hare Hare. Okay, if you're closer, that would help. So he went around the company and he got one of each kind of glove that they were using, even if they were using identical kinds in different places. And he stapled to each glove the price paid and the place where it came from. So he had a pile of 450 gloves. And on the meeting room table, the boardroom table, he had this pile of 450 gloves with these different price tags and different sources. And just simply did it at a time when there was going to be a management meeting anyway, and the managers just simply came and started walking around the table. And they just said, look, isn't this, what we do this 25? Hey, what? We're crazy. The managers automatically said, we're crazy. What are we doing? And they started thinking of solutions. And not only did they overhaul how they were buying gloves, they overhauled their purchasing in general for the company. So that's finding the feeling, invoking people's emotions. Here's another example. So children with cancer, when they're in the hospital, they're getting chemotherapy, but when they go home, they have to continue to take chemotherapy on their own to maintain their progress, and if they don't, they're likely to get a relapse. But especially kids, teenagers, they didn't want to keep taking chemotherapy when they went home. I mean, it made them nauseous, right? It was so much trouble to take the medicine, so many side effects. They didn't want to do it. So the doctors got some engineers to make a video game where the chemotherapy were the heroes slaying all the cancer cells. And interspersed in the video game were little bits of information about how their medicine worked and so forth. And they had, I forget, it was like 13 levels of this game. But they found that even the teenagers who only played the first 1 or 2 levels were much more likely to be compliant with taking the medicine. Why? Why, if they'd only played 1 or 2 levels, were they much more compliant? Well, think about this. They'd left the hospital, and for a long time, they had thought of themselves as a sick person, right? Who wants to think of yourself as a sick person, a victim, especially if you're a teenager? With the video game, all of a sudden, they were the hero. Combating, they were going to fight that cancer. Instead of the sick kid who's the victim, who has to take this medication that makes them vomit, they were the hero. Now, we talked about how the analytical part of the mind tends to see negativity and problems, right? It tends to look, where's the problems and solutions to those problems instead? Where's the bright things that I can replicate? Well, the emotional part of the mind has the opposite problem. The emotional part of the mind tends to see ourselves as much better than we are, which relates directly to your question. The emotional part of the mind tends to exaggerate how good we are, how well we're doing, how far along we are. The problem is that you can't really make a change unless people know where they are. Isn't that correct? Right? If you want to give someone directions, you want to use a GPS, you have to be honest about your current location. And our feeling part of our subtle body, our emotional part, tends to exaggerate in our favor how wonderful we are and how far ahead we are. So part of the feelings that you want to invoke are you want to invoke feelings of what is the actual situation. That was what was done with the gloves. That people got this feeling of what's the reality. Here is another example. This was the head of an accounting department who was a very heavy taskmaster. He insisted that everybody always get all of their accounting forms filled out perfectly, correctly, as we say in those of us who use English or other Latin languages. My apologies to you, those of you who use the Cyrillic alphabet or the Hebrew alphabet. Any other non-Latin? Oh, Japanese alphabet. You have 3 of them, don't you? 3 alphabet. My God. That you have to learn. But with those of us who use the Latin alphabet, we say dotting your I's and crossing your T's. In other words, you get everything exactly correct. And if everything wasn't correct, the accountant manager, the head of the accounting department, do it over, do it over, do it over, do it over. And so people would get delayed as far as getting their financial needs met in the company. Well, then the company took on a client of social workers. So social workers are those who administer to people who have some kind of need, right? Who don't have enough food, who don't have enough shelter, who have been the victims of abuse or something like that. And this accounting manager did the same thing to the people in the social work organization if they didn't turn in their forms exactly properly. Do it over, do it over, do it over. Well, then instead of just the business being hampered, kids weren't getting anything to eat. So thinking, how are we going to make this change? So they actually took this accounting manager into the social work organization and had him see for himself not only what kind of work they were doing, but the fact that the social workers were often under a very heavy emotional burden. They often had more to do than they could do. They didn't have the proper resources to get things done, and therefore it was very difficult for them to fill out these forms exactly perfectly. What happened then is that the accounting manager had an emotional change. He was still a heavy, rather nasty guy. That didn't change. But he started being heavy about facilitating the social workers instead of impeding them. So he started saying to people, hey, can't you cut this check on time? Kids are going hungry. So it appealed to his emotions. Now, you may ask, which emotions do we want to appeal to? We have what we could term negative emotions. What would negative emotions be? Shame. Anger, what? Angriness, yeah. Inadequacy. Fear. Huh? Disappointment. Frustration. Anxiety. Somebody, oh, we have a silent center here. What? Big feeling hurt. Some other negative emotions. Upset, worried. Confused. Insecure. Okay. Prema Manjari, come on, you can. What are some more negative emotions? Anxiety.
These things are not popular in this group.
Okay, what are the positive emotions? Happy. All right. What else? Huh? Joyful. Satisfied. Inspired. Peaceful. Blissful. Ecstatic, right? Huh? Energetic. Enthusiastic. Respectful. Jubilant, yeah? Patient. Oh, okay. What about curious? Now, if we look at the positive and the negative emotions, it's interesting because my family works with a project in the Govardhan Radhakund area. And we've been doing this for many, many years. We clean places in the area, depending on how much sponsorship we're getting. Each place is cleaned between 1 and 4 times a day. And we also have restored a number of the holy places, and we also feed about 100 widows every day. And there's very few organizations in that area that do daily work. There's one other organization that does daily cleaning on the Govardhan Parikrama path, but most organizations come in and do a big thing sometimes. Like, okay, it's a festival day, let's feed people. And one of our problems is people come in on a festival day to feed people. This is going to break your heart. And they use styrofoam plates. So we come in after a big festival day, and the whole Parikrama Marg is covered with styrofoam plates. So they come in, we're feeding people, and then they leave all that on the ground, and we have to come and clean it up. So we're completely dependent on international donations. We don't have any one big sponsor. We're not getting anything from the government. We've built this up from the first donor, which was me, and now we have many, many all over the world. And we decided a few years ago we wanted to make a promotional video for fundraising. If you want, I could show you this later today. It's very short. As an example. Yeah, I don't think I'll show it right now, but I could show it later. And in order to do this, I looked at promotional videos for charity. And I looked at, the top-rated ones, the top-watched ones. I also looked at just the most watched short videos in general, like what they call viral, what did millions of people see? All of them were emotional, every one of them. The vast majority of the videos that were trying to get people to give money to a charitable organization, what kinds of emotions do you think they were appealing to? Compassion? Shame? Compassion is also linked with sadness, by the way. Compassion, grief, sadness. Empathy. No. Nope. Didn't find any like that. Nope. Didn't find one. Pity. Horror. I found some horror. Shock. They're pretty much all negative. There was one that was comedy. There was one comedy one. But in general, they were negative. Grief, sadness, shock, horror. And I thought, let's do inspiration. I thought, let's do wonder, the Adbhuta Ras. So we also decided to do a wordless video because of the international nature of our society. I said, let's do something with no language so that people can equally watch it in Russia and China. It doesn't just have to be the English-speaking countries. Now, the research has shown, and this is not just sociological research, but medical research, when we are experiencing the negative emotions, our consciousness becomes narrow. Now, if you think about it, you can see why this would be the case. If there's some sort of threat We don't want to know what the flowers smell like. Right? We want to have all of our consciousness focused on that threat, and we want to shut out everything else. Are you aware that when people are being shot by a gun, they often see the bullet moving in slow motion? Do you know that? Fascinating. Look it up. Time gets distorted, space gets distorted, and you get very narrowly focused. People who are victims of crime can often identify the weapon but not the face of the person because they're, think about like Arjuna shooting the bird when he just saw the eye of the bird. My apologies if you don't know that story. I don't have time to tell it. But the idea that the negative emotions tend to focus your attention because they need to. They need to. The negative emotions imply that there may be some kind of a threat. The positive emotions have the opposite effect, that they open your awareness for creativity, and they're very much associated with play. Now, if we think about this spiritually, of course, there's the 12 rasas do include what we would call negative. There are rasas of anger and fear and horror. But all of those are experienced as ecstatic bliss. And all of these are involved in Krishna with play. So if you want people to make a change, you actually want them to be more creative, isn't it? Whenever you want an organization or people to make a change, often you're having them make a change in something that's a habit. You want them to be able to think creatively, as we say, out of the box. So you're far more likely to get that results if the feeling that you find involves at least something positive. Okay, next area of motivating the elephant, is to shrink the change. Now, the elephant, being emotional, can get spooked by any change that seems really big and complicated. So you want to make it appear that the change is as small as possible. Now, there's a very interesting study that was done with a car wash. So if you look closely here, you'll see here if you get 8 car washes, you get a free car wash. And here you need 10. But here, they give you the card with 2 X's already there. So both of them are really only 8. Okay? But for the people who got the one with the 2 X's, 34% of them filled out their cards and got a free car wash. And the people who had 8, only 19%. Why? Because the people who had 2 X's thought, I've already done part of it. I've already done part of it.
I thought you was going to conclude the other way.
No.
Because I thought by seeing 10.
No. Because you think you've already... I tell you, as a preacher of Krishna consciousness, I do this all the time. Because people often feel that Krishna consciousness is unattainable. This is a problem not only for us, but for anyone taking up a religious path. They look at the goal and they look at themselves and they see the difference is just insurmountable. They feel full of guilt, which is a negative emotion, one of the most destructive of the negative emotions. They feel full of guilt at their inability to live up to their ideals, and so they give up, more or less. They may give up completely, or they may only chant 4 rounds, or, something. They scale back their effort and their initiative because it's too much. It's too hard. It's too big of a change. So one of the things I do regularly is to remind people of what they've already done and what they're already doing. Which reminds us of another study that dealing with exercise. In this study, women who cleaned in hotels and offices were given information about how many calories they were burning by doing their regular cleaning activities. So they were told, when you change a bed, you burn this many calories. When you vacuum the floor, you burn this many calories, and so forth and so on. Then there was another identical group of cleaning women who were simply told that they should exercise, and that exercise was good for you. And then, of course, they had a control group where they did nothing. Then after some time, they found that these cleaning ladies, I forget how long it was, like 2-3 weeks, they had actually lost weight without doing any other exercise that they were aware of. And the researchers were like, how is it that by telling these women that what they were doing was already exercise, that they lost weight without doing any additional conscious exercise? So the best guess is that these women got excited. They thought, I'm already exercising. And maybe they, did a little extra vacuuming or something. Just added a little extra because they were already enthused. Yes?
Well, it's so hard to get to the gym.
We'll get there. Just a few more slides. We have a going to the gym one. Yeah.
It's also possible that it's mind over matter. They thought, I'm losing so much weight.
It could be.
Actually lost it.
Well, that was actually, the researchers' first conclusion was that it was a placebo effect. So that's possible, but it's also possible that they unconsciously just started doing more of their cleaning activities because they perceived it in a different way. So when people say things like, well, I'm not experiencing Krishna consciousness, then it's like, well, wait a minute, haven't you ever felt amazing when you had some prasadam? Did you ever have some prasadam and you thought, wow, what is the taste of this prasadam? It's just, flour and water and salt. Actually, it happened to me the night I arrived here. One devotee brought me some prasadam, brought me some rice and sabji, and I just took one bite of the rice, and I was like, wow. It was just rice. It was plain rice. So we have this experience, right? That's a spiritual experience. We're in a kirtan, and we experience some happiness that we can't explain just by the expertise of the musicians. I'm sure there's a lot more expert musician in some concert hall somewhere. But we have an experience that can't be explained by the material or superficial aspects of the experience. So when I remind people of that, they're like, oh, yeah. Or sometimes you remind people of what an art is they've already given up. I actually had this experience where Krishna did this with me. I was preaching, where was I again? I can't remember. I think it was somewhere in the GCC countries. And somebody asked a question about, what do I do if I have friends and family who don't like Krishna consciousness? And I want to be a devotee, but I don't want to give up my friends. And the thought went through my mind, what a ridiculous problem. What a silly problem. Why is this person so upset about this problem? There are so many bigger problems to be upset about. And then Krishna in the heart said to me, do you remember when you had that problem? Do you remember when for you the biggest question was, what do I do with my mother who doesn't like Krishna consciousness? What do I do with my friends in the university who don't like Krishna consciousness? And I remembered, I used to have that problem. And it used to be a very big problem. And now the problem for me is so much nothing that I forgot I even had it. And I thought, I've actually made some progress in Krishna consciousness. It was really interesting, because sometimes I look at myself and I think, it seems the more I chant Hare Krishna, the more I'm aware of how fallen I am. That happens, by the way. If that hasn't happened to you yet, it will. Yeah, there you go. So it was interesting that Krishna reminded me that a problem that I thought was very serious and very urgent had completely disappeared. Look at that. So one way you can motivate the elephant, the emotional part, is to shrink the change. And one way you can shrink the change is to show people how they've already started to do it. They've already made some progress. They've already taken the first few steps in some way or another. Another way to shrink the change is to ask, yes? Not now. I'm only willing to go so far off topic.
So this is reminding our what we've done. Is this emotions or it's going to
We're right now all with the elephant. We're in the realm of the elephant now. This is the elephant's jurisdiction. So we finished the rider. If you have this, so we finished the rider, and you can see we're on the first. This is your little map. We're on the first thing with the elephant, finding the. No, we're on the second thing. We're on shrinking the change. We did find the feeling. Now we're on shrinking the change. So one way you can shrink the change is by showing people you've already made a step. You've already done something. You can say, just by coming to this meeting, you've taken your first step. Something where you make the change smaller. Another way to make the change smaller is to ask for something very small in terms of time. Can you spend 5 minutes cleaning your room every day? Can you read one verse a day? Vaisheshika does this as far as reading Prabhupada's books. He's taken, how to read the whole Bhagavatam in 2 years or something, and, I forget the exact numbers, but something like 40 pages a day, something like that. Maybe some of you know the exact. And he also does something we'll get to later called Rally the Herd, where you're with a group that's doing this. But he breaks the change down into small increments. Like we say, how do you eat a watermelon, right? In little pieces, little bits. So you break the change up into small bits, and you ask people to do a small bit. You can also have small wins, right? Some small win. And because, when there's this whole mountain of problems, we tend to go to helplessness and powerlessness, right? And you can't counter out that with just a bunch of math and numbers and graphs. You want to prove to people that they can actually do something. So you give them something in the direction of the change that they can do, and that they can do quickly. And you want to select small wins that have 2 factors. The first factor is that they mean something. They're not just symbolic. And the other thing is that they're within immediate reach. If you can't get both, get the immediate reach.
What's the immediate reach?
Something they could achieve immediately with the resources that they have on hand. So an example of this is I sometimes talk about the fact that in the Hare Krishna movement, we need to encourage children to exist. We don't, by the way. We very much encourage childlessness in the Hare Krishna movement. Childlessness, and if you just really want to do it, then just have 1 or 2. So we have a very anti-child mood. It's in the world in general, but so just to encourage for there to be children, and then to encourage that the children are welcome and they're facilitated, that we have schools for the children, we have programs for the children. Now, most of the time when I talk to devotees about this, which I don't get an opportunity very often to talk about it at all, but if I do get an opportunity, to most people this seems really big. Oh my God, do I have to open a school for 3,000 kids? They're just like, their mind becomes boggled. Do I have to build a room for the mothers with young children to hear Bhagavatam class? And I say, you know what you can do if you see a child in the temple room? Smile at them and say, Hare Krishna, nice to have you here. You know, when I was bringing my kids to Hare Krishna temples, there were a lot of people that would say, can you get that kid out of here? He's making too much noise. And I say to people, you know, if you say to the kids, get out, get out, get out, get out, get out, eventually the kid gets to be 18 and says, okay, bye. So this is something anybody can do. Anybody can just, Hare Krishna, nice to have you here. Smile at the mother. You know, if the kid's crying, the person in distress is the parent. Smile at the parent. It's okay. Kids make noise. It's all right. Just a little kindness to parents and a little kindness to children. If everybody in ISKCON would do that, the atmosphere would start to change. Is that something anybody can do? Yeah. That's shrinking the change and giving a fast win. And by the way, that makes a big difference. It's not a small thing to have somebody smile at you and make you feel welcome, or to have somebody ignore you, or to have somebody make you feel unwelcome. So that's just one example. But look for small things in the direction of the change that people can do immediately with the resources at hand. And if those things can be meaningful, so much the better. That's another way to shrink your change. Okay, the last thing we're going to look at here, and yes, I've decided we are going to do the last third of this after lunch. Another way to deal with the elephant, the last way we're going to look at, is to grow the people. So instead of making the change smaller, make your people bigger. And we're going to look at this particularly in terms of identity. Particularly in terms of identity. And this concept that people act according to identity is a very fundamental principle of spiritual life. So here's a story of the island of St. Lucia in the Caribbean. And this island had a parrot, the St. Lucia parrot. This parrot only existed on the island and still only exists on the island of St. Lucia. But the problem was people were destroying the habitat of this parrot. People were also hunting and eating the parrot. And people were trapping the parrots as pets and exporting them and so forth. And so basically, the prediction was that by the year 2000, there would not be a single St. Lucia parrot left in St. Lucia. So the government brought in a scientist and asked him what to do, and he said, well, I think that we should increase the punishment for capturing or killing the parrot from a small fine to an enormous fine, plus going to jail. We should also have a parrot sanctuary within our forest that would protect the parrot's habitat, and we should raise money for the reserve by licensing rainforest tours. Those are all very good ideas, but there was no money or manpower in the government to back up those ideas. So none of them could be done. Now, this is often the case, right? We see something, we think of these great solutions, but there's no money, there's no manpower in order to implement them. So, yes? Well, you'd still have to have some sort of enforcement, and you'd have to have some will on the part of the government. Good question. Yes. Well, we'll look at that in the last 2 days on the 28th through the 30th about policy implementation also, why such things can be difficult. Excellent. Now, one problem that the scientists had is that there wasn't any clear economic case for saving the parrot. The parrot wasn't instrumental to the St. Lucia economy. It wasn't a crucial species in the whole ecosystem. And most St. Lucians didn't even know it existed and probably wouldn't even care if it died. So, he decided that he was going to grow the people. He was going to convince the people that the St. Lucian parrot was a very important part of their identity. So he started doing some public events where he would say, "This is our parrot. Nobody else has this parrot but us." He got local music bands to contribute money to make T-shirts with pictures of the St. Lucia parrot. He got local hotels to contribute money to print up bumper stickers. He got volunteers to dress as parrots and visit schools. He got ministers to recite Bible verses about stewarding your environment and talking about the parrots. He even got a telecom company to print up St. Lucia parrot calling cards. He started making propaganda that this is the St. Lucia parrot. This is our parrot. This is our parrot. We're St. Lucians, and this is our St. Lucian parrot. And the St. Lucians began to just embrace this parrot like it had always been part of their national identity, which it hadn't been up until then. Gradually, after making this propaganda, which was all from donated resources, there was enough public support to pass these kind of laws to protect the parrot that he had wanted to do initially. By 2008, the parrot had gone up to several hundred, which was amazing for a parrot that only had like 10 members left. And there was no record in 2008 of any parrot having been shot or captured illegally. That was all by changing people's identity. Now, this man then went on to 50 different countries and used the same approach to protect and encourage endangered species or endangered habitat by connecting that change to the people's identity. Now, something similar that's mentioned in another book by the same authors was a problem with littering, with throwing rubbish on the side of the road. And this was happening in America in the state of Texas. Now, Texas in America is an interesting state. It used to be its own country.
Cowboy state.
Yeah, what?
Cowboy state.
Yeah, cowboy state. But there's other cowboy states like Wyoming and South Dakota. But Texas used to be its own country. California also used to be its own country. And those two states have a little different idea of who they are. There's a very strong Texan mentality of like the tough guy kind of thing. Now, they noticed who was doing the most littering. What demographic do you think was doing the most littering? Males of what age? Males of what ages? Exactly, yes. So young males. So they found that the people doing the most littering were young males. So they decided to appeal to their identity. So they got a bunch of Texas American football players, which is different from European football. You know what American football players look like, right? Kind of like gorillas. So they got these guys, and they'd had advertisements where they're walking on the side of the road, and they see a beer can on the side of the road. They pick it up, they take the beer can, they crush it, and they throw it in a rubbish bin, and they say, "Don't mess with Texas." That was appealing to the Texan mentality, the Texan identity, that we're these tough guys. And it was especially appealing to the identity of the people who were littering. Isn't that wonderful? that if we're a tough young Texan male, we don't mess with Texas and we don't litter. Reversed it. You see, that's also actually appealing to positive emotions, isn't it? Right? Imagine if you appeal to people's guilt. What are you doing to your home? How can you dare throw garbage in your home? That would be really appealing to an 18-year-old male, right? That would go a long way. So, appealing to identity. The way that things work for anyone, actually a conditioned soul or a liberated soul, is that the way that we make decisions in life, we ask 3 questions. Who am I? What is this situation? What does a person of my identity, an ideal person in this identity, do in this situation? You know, I am a good Indian housewife. What does good Indian housewife do? That's how we think. We have a little label on ourselves. You know, I am a this. I am a this. Then we look at the situation and say, someone who's a this, what would they do in this situation? That's what I'm going to do. We don't really look at pros and cons. You know, we have these things we do, plus, minus, interesting. But that's not psychologically how we make any major decisions in our life at all. That's how we may make a very minor decision. I mean, I'm just thinking about one person I knew grew up in the movement and grew up, you know, with kind of intentional austerity. Devotees are simple, devotees are austere. A person's still a devotee, but they said, I don't want to live like that. I want to live like a typical American. So I was visiting this family, and they had a small table for eating. And the devotee said to me, you know, we've just been in this house for a year. I think if you've owned a house for a year, it's okay to have a small table. You know, but after you've owned a house for at least 2 years, people expect you to have a large dining room table. So he had a certain identity. What is a middle-class American expected to do? And he was going to purchase a table based on not his needs for eating. You follow? He wasn't going to buy a table based on how many people eat at our house, how many people are in our family. But I'm a middle-class American. And this is the kind of table a middle-class American purchases. Identities are central to the way we make decisions. If you try to have a change that violates people's identity, it won't work. And often what we do with change is we just look for rewards and punishment, which relates to, Mars, what we were talking about yesterday, when you were talking about giving a reward to people, right? But if that reward doesn't sync with people's identities, it will not motivate them. If someone's reward or punishment is in opposition to my identity, I'm going to stick to my identity and not care about the reward or punishment. That's why people will die for their beliefs being tortured. Isn't it? Yes? Now, by the way, identities in this world are malleable. So you can appeal to people's current identities. You can also change their identity. So let's look at appealing to current identities. We had a hospital where there was a high turnover of nurses. Most of the nurses wouldn't stay. Most would leave. And as we'll see when we discuss in the 28th through the 30th, when you have instability of personnel, it's very hard to implement anything. It's hard to get it to stick when the people you're trying to get to do something are constantly different people. Right? Just like even here with this class. Some people came in late. and then I had to repeat the same instructions, right? Does that make sense? And if people keep coming in late, then I have to keep repeating the same instructions. And eventually, I'm going to stop doing that, so the people who come in really late, they're not giving the instructions. So turnover in an organization, I worked in a school as part of my PhD, where they said, we're using this particular discipline approach. But when I went to the school, I saw that only 2 out of the 22 teachers were using that discipline approach. I said, do you train the teachers? Oh, yes, we did a training 5 years ago. I said, but now half the teachers are different. So it's very, very difficult to sustain anything with a high turnover rate. So they looked at the nurses who stayed, bright spots again. They looked at the nurses who stayed, and they find out that the nurses who stayed did so primarily because of their identity. They loved nursing. They loved the career of nursing. So they started having, as part of any of their educational programs, whenever they were educating people about medicine or procedures or safety or whatever, they would always emphasize the rewards and the joys of nursing. And their turnover rate was cut significantly. In terms of creating a new identity, a factory that made metal cans. Does that sound very inspiring? If you're making metal cans. They started calling the workers inventors. And they started rewarding them and encouraging them to invent ways of making better cans more efficiently. And that's exactly what people started to do. So they actually changed and morphed their identity. Okay, the last thing we're going to look at as far as growing your people is build in expectations of failure. Build in expectations of failure. One way in which the emotional part of us is hesitant to take a change is we know that there's a good likelihood we're going to fail. And emotionally, we don't want to fail, right? But if you build into people that the way to success is going to have failure along the route, expect that you're going to have failure. It makes people bigger and more competent at being able to go forward. It's another way of growing your people. It actually makes people feel optimistic. Yes, I'm going to be able to get there even if I fail. Think of so many true inspirational stories you've read of people who had so many obstacles and so many failures, right? I'm sure you've read so many stories like this. And they persisted through the failure. So those stories are there because part of growing your people and preparing them for a change and getting them inspired for a change is to anticipate those failures so when they come, they're not discouraged. When they come, they feel they're ready for it. There was one school, for example, that never gave failing grades. Gave grades of A, B, C, and not yet. So 3 ways to deal with the emotional side. Find the feeling. Something positive generally works better, but engage the emotions. Shrink the change by showing people that in ways they've already started. Asking for small increments, giving easy wins. Grow people by using their identity, by building their identity, or by expecting failure. So we meet again at 3:30, is that right? So we meet again at 3:30. At 3:30, we're going to go over shaping the path. And then I'm going to show you a short video. And after that, we're going to examine 6 what they call clinics, which are examples of changes. So you can have, there's 4 of them printed, 2 of them are electronic, and you're just going to go into groups and discuss these. We're going to so we'll have probably, I guess about, of the 2 hours, we'll have 45 minutes to an hour to finish this, and the rest of the time to go over the clinics. And then starting tomorrow, you're going to be working on doing all these things, having all these 9 things. We're going to spend 1 session on each main one. So 1 session on the rider, 1 on the elephant, and 1 on the path, which we haven't discussed yet, with a change that you want to see done. So please, please make sure that you come tomorrow with your lump of clay. And please come this afternoon with some electronic device that has a screen big enough to read something on it, and with those electronic files and also the printout. Thank you. Hare Krishna.